This edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and it's the afternoon of Friday, the 24th of February, and it is a time of crisis now. We have entered into a regime, I think, of almost permanent crisis. We have a crisis of legitimacy. We have a constitutional crisis boiling somewhat under the surface. We have any number of symptoms of destabilization. And we're always comparing this to the Nixon administration and always coming up with the idea that the time has accelerated. In other words, things that took a long time back in the early 1970s have now begun to move along. So I would say in the past 24 hours, we would have to look at, in particular, the news of a conversation among Reince Priebus, the chief of staff here in the White House, who at various times talked with a guy called McCabe, who is a top official of the FBI. I guess he's the deputy director or something at this level. And also with James Comey, the still director of the FBI, right? Somebody who has dabbled in politics quite a bit and thrown over just about all the traditional safeguards that had been instituted after Watergate. Comey has pretty much made those less effective than they ever were. And the issue was this, according to the original headlines, and I think this is pretty much the report, right? This is all coming from leaks. Yes, coming from leaks. And essentially says that in this conversation, Priebus suggested to the two guys from the FBI, Comey and McCabe, that it would be time to knock down the reports of constant, continuous contact between the Trump campaign on the one hand and the Kremlin, the government of the Russian Federation, on the other. This is already a startlingly unorthodox thing for them to do, for Priebus to do, because this question of attempts by the chief executive, the White House, to influence the behavior of the FBI, this is a hot potato. It has been a hot potato ever since 1972, 1973. If you look at those Nixon tapes, there are different points where Nixon says, you got to get so-and-so to testify this and so-and-so to testify that. And, of course, what Nixon is talking about is at a certain point he says we have to use the CIA to block the FBI, and he has all these schemes. And these are the things that actually got him to a situation where he had to quit the presidency. This time, there's a distinction, and this distinction is being drawn. Now, whether this is a valid distinction, we'll know this fairly soon, I think. It is that there's a difference between trying to say, stop investigating this, or investigate this track but not that track, right? Ignore that possible explanation but cultivate this one. That's one thing. That's illegal, I'm pretty sure, even today. But then there's another one which says, here in the public domain, we have these persistent reports, and these are hurting us. And, therefore, you guys at the FBI should say something. You should say that this is all spurious, or this is all specious, or this is invalid, that doesn't have a leg to stand on. It's not even there. Now, the attempt is by apologists, and I think we're seeing a kind of maybe a backlash against the steady diet of revelations, which I think that's a dangerous tendency. I mean, the backlash, in other words, the desire to minimize some of these things. I don't think you can minimize them. So the question, therefore, is, was this simply a question of public relations, or was this the attempt to influence the course of an investigation? These, I suppose, are different, but in practice, they're hard to separate, aren't they? And I think what you're going to find is that this is a very dangerous terrain, because once you start with this, you don't know where it's going to go. The other question is that there are guidelines, right? There were instituted after Watergate a kind of limits, right? Strictures. How many people in the White House are authorized to talk to the FBI about these sorts of ongoing matters? And again, there's this quibble about what sorts of ongoing matters. This was then hollowed out. These guidelines were essentially gutted by George W. Bush and his crew, right under this is the time of John Ashcroft, when Comey was also in I guess he was in the Department of Justice, so he knows something about this stuff. The guidelines were gutted, and it became a list of, I think, 950 people from the White House who could talk to the Department of Justice, which is a very large part, or the quasi-totality maybe, of people working in the White House. But they were then restored, and they were restored after the departure of Alberto Gonzales as Attorney General, and after this affair, right, where George W. Bush fired a whole bunch of U.S. attorneys. It is then Mukasey as the Attorney General, right? I guess the Attorney General under George W. Bush. Mukasey came forward and he said, and you can see the executive order, which he promoted, in other words, guidelines set up under Mukasey, that the White House counsel and the Deputy White House counsel or the president could talk to the Department of Justice, but not others. And those not others would include the White House Chief of Staff. That would be, of course, Reince Priebus. So under those guidelines, this is not an approved practice. This is in the terrain of something which is not acceptable. So we are left with that. And naturally, every time something like this happens, the question goes back to Comey. Because as everyone knows, Comey was one of the principal factors in the outcome of the 2016 election. And as I have tried to point out, right, people who go around prating about the deep state and people who go around prating about the shadow government and things like this, they have to come to terms with the fact that there seems to be what I would call a rogue network. It exists in the FBI, and it looked pretty much like it was heavily engaged on the side of the Republican national ticket last time around. And that would be Comey's lecturing, his berating, his disparagement of Hillary Clinton in his July speech, even though he didn't indict her. Then his late October letter saying, oh, my God, we've got all these emails. I just want everybody to know we're looking. And then finally his last letter in November of last year said, we didn't find anything. Forget the whole thing. That's Comey. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's February 24th, 2017. Now remember, you got to keep up with this stuff day by day. Everything is moving faster. The crisis is accelerating. Political changes are occurring at a breathtaking pace. And to try to keep up with that, we have instituted this Monday through Thursday program, The American System. So if you want to keep up, if you want to do something to help my work, support what I'm doing, which I think is worthwhile and I hope unique, then the tick is americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and for a token fee, the cost of a couple of frappuccini, you can come right on there and listen to that every evening. So that's the American System. Please look it up. Americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Now, whether or not this has devastating potential, a little bit hard to say, but it could. And I think we can sort of read the importance of this moment now from some of the behavior of those that are immediately involved. And let's start with the tenant of the White House. So Donald J. Trump, real Donald J. Trump, writes 2 tweets this morning at 7:31 a.m. and 7:36 a.m. And here we read, "The FBI is totally unable to stop the national security, quote, leakers, unquote, that have permeated our government for a long time. They can't even," and here we have ellipsis and we jump to the next tweet, "they can't even find the leakers within the FBI itself. Classified information is being given to media that could have a devastating effect on U.S. Find now." And the find now is in all caps. So it is a peremptory order to the FBI to find out who within the FBI is leaking this stuff. Now, this is independent of the fact that the White House has confirmed that there was such a conversation. As a matter of fact, the way I understand it now, it's a little bit murky. I think some people would like it to stay murky. But the idea was that this guy McCabe, the number 2 or the subordinate of Comey, was the one who brought it up. In other words, it was McCabe who said to Priebus, according to this version that I'm referring to, it was this McCabe who said, by the way, that stuff about the Russian contacts, that's overstated or something like this, right? What kind of stuff is that? Remember, we're now in the world of double standards, huh? We're in the world of heavy duty double standards. You may remember the outrage among these reactionary Republicans when they found out that Bill Clinton had buttonholed Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, on some airport taxiway or some airport, and talked to her about we don't know what, but it was assumed, something about Hillary Clinton's server, Hillary Clinton's treatment of classified material, emails, and all the rest of it. So if that was a high-handed outrage, then, dear friends, what is it where the FBI guy comes to Priebus at some gathering and says, hey, guess what? And then starts talking about things that he has no business talking about. So we're now in a very murky and chaotic scene. Anyway, those are the two tweets that we have from this morning, and you can see I think this betrays something that cannot be hidden, which is a concern about what this is and where it goes. Now, that's the immediate situation. And this, of course, is then the visit after this. In the course of today, we've got this thing going on, the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, which is, of course, a gathering of these, well, they call themselves conservatives, right? We've always said really reactionary or right-wing radical would be a more accurate term. But we've had the President Trump go there today and essentially do a rendition of his standard stump speech. His campaign speech was what he did. And this is, these are blasts from the past. These are the greatest hits of 2016. There's something in Congress, though, that he simply repeats this stuff. And the promises, the assurances, the promises, getting a little bit out of date, right? In other words, we're told that all of this stuff is going to happen very, very soon. But somehow it's always mañana, or sometimes it's even next week. You'll remember, I think we've been waiting for 2 or 3 weeks for a replacement for the original January 27th executive order. Remember that one? The one that caused all of the demonstrations at the airports. We're told that Trump was surprised by the wave of protest against that January 27th executive order, and that he felt that General Flynn had not warned him, had not prepared him for the vehemence of the protest backlash against what was being done. So remember, we were told then that there'd be a new one the following week, and then we were told there was going to be one the week after that. So not in the week of the 30th to the 3rd, the 6th to the 10th. No, didn't happen. 13th to the 17th. No. And now it's the 20th to the 24th. And we're being told that the new executive order is coming next week. This is getting to be a pattern, isn't it? And part of this is there may not be a way to do this within the constraints of the Constitution and even of existing statutes, right, which do take precedent over the mere executive order. So all of that is happening, and I think that's really the principal comment I would make about the president's speech at CPAC, that it's repeating promises. And it's all described as imminent. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., continuing with our program for the 24th of February. Now, we've just gotten some interesting developments. There's supposed to be a White House press briefing just about every day, right, at 1 o'clock or so, maybe 2, depends. And some of these cable networks have started to broadcast that, right? So what a wonderful opportunity to get free airtime for your spokes, right? Sean Spicer, even though he takes his lumps, right? If you get your guy on TV and he can give the party line, well, you want to do that, don't you? So here's what happened today. For some reason, the trigger is not clear, and I'm reading this now from Huffington Post. The news is the White House has blocked, excluded, banned several news outlets from attending a briefing. It's called a closed-door briefing. I don't know what that means in particular. But here on Friday afternoon with Press Secretary Sean Spicer. And this decision has drawn strong rebukes from news organizations and may only heighten tension between the press corps and the administration. And I think that the next Saturday Night Live is a week from Saturday, unfortunately, not this week. Maybe they ought to change their schedule and go weekly. So here's who got excluded. It was the failing New York Times. The failing New York Times, which has been given a reprieve, right? They've been given a new lease on life by the current administration. The New York Times and CNN, similarly given a reprieve from dire financial difficulty, although they're also responsible for giving a lot of that $2 to $3 billion in free time to the winner of the election. New York Times and CNN have been prohibited from attending. Wow. The Huffington Post was also excluded. The Associated Press and Time magazine were allowed in, but they decided not to attend because they wanted to show solidarity with the news organizations that were banned. Now, you remember there was an idea of moving the press room out of the West Wing, putting it in the old executive office building, right? Putting it somewhere else, a good distance away. That didn't go anywhere. And then there was this idea of calling off the daily press briefing, right, with the media group there in the press room, right? It's called the James Brady room, I think, in honor of Reagan's spokesperson who was shot by Hinckley, remember, and severely wounded. So the executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Backwet, says nothing like this has ever happened at the White House in our long history of covering multiple administrations of different parties. We strongly protest the exclusion of the New York Times and other news organizations. Free media access to a transparent government is obviously of crucial national interest. And CNN says CNN was blocked from the White House press secretary's media gaggle today. Gaggle, I guess, press briefing. This is our response, and here's what they say. This is an unacceptable development by the White House. Apparently, this is how they retaliate when you report facts that they don't like. We'll keep reporting regardless. Now, CNN, I think, was one of the early ones to tell this story about the transactions, what can we say, the exchange, the contact between Priebus and Comey, or Comey-McCabe of the FBI. The head of the White House Correspondents Association at the moment is a Reuters correspondent by the name of Jeff Mason, and he says their board of the White House Correspondents Association is protesting strongly against how today's gaggle is being handled by the White House. We encourage the organizations that were allowed in to share the material with others in the press corps who were not allowed in. The board will be discussing this further with the White House staff. So, this was, it's not exactly clear what the nature of this event was, but at any rate, one spokesperson for the White House said, we invited the press pool, so everybody was represented. We decided to add a couple of additional people beyond the pool, nothing more than that. Well, very strange. Now, here's something that may also put this in some perspective. We're being told from the august quarters of the Oval Office that the press are the enemy, they're the opposition. By the way, in a democratic system, the opposition is not the enemy. It's supposed to be part of the system. It's supposed to be actually an indispensable part, because if you don't have an opposition, you really don't have a democratic system. There's got to be the right to have an opposition. Otherwise, you have a one-party state, right? There's no opposition. So if the parties can't be the opposition, then the media sometimes has to. I don't see any scandal with this. Anyway, we have a poll from, yesterday, 23rd, updated anyway, with the day before yesterday. So here's a Quinnipiac poll, and it says, of the American population in general, 52% of voters trust the media more than they trust Trump. 37% say they trust Trump more. Among Democrats, 86% say they trust the media more than the president. But of course, the Republicans, a smaller group, they say no. 78% insist that Trump is more trustworthy than the media. Only 13% trust the media more. So there's your lineup on the enemy of the American people. This enemy of the people, I think, has a kind of French revolutionary, sort of Jacobin overtone, right? We can almost see the guillotine being brought into view when you hear some of this language. So the funny thing here is, according to the Quinnipiac pollster. The media, so demonized by the Trump people, is actually a good deal more popular than President Trump. When it comes to the way that Trump is treating these media people, 61% of American people disapprove of this rhetoric, 92% disapprove of the negative rhetoric, and 73% of Republicans approve of it. But even there, 90% of all American voters say it is very important or somewhat important for the media to hold public officials accountable. So that's interesting news. Now let's just take a look at this CPAC a little bit more, because we've had an appearance there by the resident White House ideologist, and that is to say Steve Bannon, came out there and made a show of unity, backslapping bonhomie with Reince Priebus. Now, I think this was before Reince Priebus, the story broke about Reince and the FBI. But there was this attempt to essentially quell rumors about... Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we're reporting from Washington. A lot of the stuff around town in these couple of days has to do with the CPAC. It was created to try to unify the various currents of the reactionary world, as I would describe it. And it's therefore the exchange of ideas among these different groups. The interesting thing was the joint appearance, right? Not a speech, but rather a kind of a Q&A with Bannon, Reince Priebus, and a guy called Schlapp, the current head of the American Conservative Union, I guess it is, right? And this, he's been on the job there for 2 or 3 years. And previous, there was a different leadership group, right? Last year, Trump came in third in their straw poll, but this year the place belongs to him, which of course indicates a kind of opportunism, I guess we can say, that if you were what used to be called a movement conservative, and if you read books like, I think the guy's name is George Nash, and it's called the Conservative Intellectual Movement in America. If you're a Buckleyite conservative, National Review conservative, right, free trade, free market, all this stuff, it should not be easy to make the transition to the current White House, except if this is simply a matter of expediency, right? And simply, orienting towards the winner or whoever seems to be on top at the moment. So I think it's fair to say either that the old Buckleyite conservative ideology is either in severe crisis or that it's moribund. Where is it going to go? And the same thing would really go for that other component of the Republican Party, which would be the so-called evangelical Christians, right? And I think what they have shown is that for a lot of them, their faith, their devotion to religion is in question, whereas their devotion to money and power, I think, seems to be a bit stronger. So this is essentially now an ideological void. And, nature abhors a vacuum. So along come Priebus and especially, though, Bannon. Now, Bannon didn't do much primping before this program started right on the stage. And, however, he had some formulations about what's going on. Essentially, the heart of Bannon is that he says there are three verticals. Three verticals. Now, that's a kind of a funny language, right, to talk about verticals, right? And the place where you hear about verticals is in Russian, right? And when they say vertical, they mean, I guess, a chain of command or a line of authority coming down, right? But that's how Bannon talks, right? I don't know where he got it. But there it is. So he says there are three verticals or buckets, right? Baskets, maybe, buckets. So one of them is national security and sovereignty. And I'm afraid this essentially means a campaign to break up the existing the existing multilateral institutions of the world and replace them with something else. Now, the main thing, it seems to me, is the desire to wreck the existing system, the multilateral system. So what would this mean? Well, the United Nations, first and foremost, created by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1945, right? He convinced Stalin to join it, gave him incentives to join it, gave him a couple of extra votes, Ukraine and Belarus. Then, of course, we have the European Union, right? The old European Community, Euratom, Schuman Plan, coal and steel union and all this stuff. Now the full-fledged European Union with, 27 countries involved. And then we have NATO, right? We have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We actually have other organizations. We have ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, U.S., and then the U.S., of course, does have bilateral treaties with countries like Japan. But the thing with Bannon is a strong ideology. It's an ideological fixation on the idea that the multilateral stuff is no good, that the U.S. is suffering because of these multilateral arrangements. I think this is simply not borne out in facts. In other words, in Europe, where you have the multilateral principle, I think most prominently developed, because there you have NATO, you have the European Union, of course they all think in terms of the United Nations. It seems to me that they are probably farther away from a war coming out, say, of Western Europe or Central Europe, right, among these countries. Like, is it likely that there'll be a war between France and Italy, or France and Spain, or Switzerland and Luxembourg, right? I don't see this. But if you just have everything bilateral, you're back to pre-1914. So what is it that they like so much about the pre-1914 world? Can it be this heady brew of danger that it represents? Because you remember, if you're a Nietzschean, and I think these people are, then you have to mock the desire of the middle class for security and for well-being. That is inferior, right? Even neocons say this, right? They say, I can't imagine how a great country like the U.S. is going to get hung up over, old age pensions or medical insurance, right? We have to be so much greater than that. Well, for a lot of people, this is a very, very important thing. It's the main stuff. So when the various reactionary schools of thought express their contempt for this desire for security in the middle class, they're simply showing how out of touch they are, right? They're in touch with Nietzsche, but not in touch with Peoria. And I think as people see that, they're going to conclude. Anyway, so the national security and sovereignty bucket, or vertical, is to break up the world organizations, to fragment and atomize the world, and leave this then in the pre-1914. But it won't even be pre-1914, because pre-1914 you did have alliances, right? This would just become, dare I say it, a Hobbesian war of all against all. It is the bellum omnium contra omnes, theorized by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan, right, back in the early to mid 1600s that we're dealing with here, I'm afraid. So again, sovereignty. Some of this stuff is really inexplicable. In other words, it represents a purely arbitrary choice in some ways, right? And it's also, you can see the desire to shock, the desire to negate existing norms, right? In other words, a kind of a desire to tear down. I mean, the guy that I think of most when I hear this stuff, there was an anarchist by the name of Makhno. He was Nestor Makhno, and he was active in in parts of Russia, part of Ukraine. I mean, this is Ukraine right after World War I. So this guy was an anarcho-communist, and he had an anarchist army in Ukraine during the time of 1917 to 1922. And I'll tell you what he said in just a minute. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. There was that guy, Makhno, back in the time of the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922, thereabouts. And his motto was, "My job is to destroy. It will be up to others to rebuild." So, is something like this going on? Because there's a lot of talk of getting rid of the existing order, right? Repeal Obamacare, but not very much on the replacement side. And I think this is a dangerous tendency, right? The great work of human civilization has taken millennia. And the idea that in some kind of a, what is on the historical scale, a fit of momentary peak, you're going to throw things overboard like that. I wouldn't do it. The other question is, to get to a European Union, it took 2 world wars with all of that suffering, all that death, all that incalculable destruction. Finally, people said, look, maybe the sovereignty part can be relativized a little bit with peace and prosperity. And you're not going to give it up, but you want to somehow keep it in proportion. And you see some of the results. So anyway, here's Bannon. Bannon goes to CPAC, and he's got his 3-point program, right? The Trinity, I guess we could say. So sovereignty and national security. So again, I read this as breaking up the multilateral institutions. His second point is economic nationalism. And I deny that he represents nationalism. That is not nationalism. Nationalism, you go back to, say, 1860, right? Who were the nationalists on the scene? Abraham Lincoln was the nationalist on the scene, and this was an attempt to uplift all the people. When you say a policy is national, it means that it's got to benefit everybody in that relevant population. And, of course, the people who were secessionists, if you're a secessionist or if you have any of that ethos, right, the Confederate flag or any of that stuff, you are not a nationalist. You're an anti-nationalist because you're proposing to break up the country. And today, of course, if you're proposing to essentially declare war on 20 or 30% of your own population, you are no nationalist. It is impossible to see it in those terms. And remember, Abraham Lincoln had to essentially get through the leftovers of this know-nothing movement. What I see is know-nothingism here, right? Know-nothingism is not nationalism, especially in the United States. Because in a country based on immigration, right, along come the know-nothings and say, every Catholic is an agent of the Pope or of the Austrian Emperor, and we don't like them, right? So those then become the copperheads of the era of the Civil War. So that is not nationalism. And if you want to impart benefits, I would say to Bannon, why don't you talk about full employment? In other words, if you want to talk about benefits, let's get straight to the benefits. We don't have to go through profound institutional reforms. We have everything we need. We know what to do based on the New Deal and so forth. Talk about full employment. Talk about a rising standard of living. Talk about that. Talk about increased longevity, right? The big problem in blue-collar America is that the life expectancy is going down. We've just got the news this week that in South Korea, women in South Korea are about to attain an average life expectancy of 90 years of age. Here in the United States, we're going backwards. Can we hear about this? Again, we talked about natalism before. Natalism is one thing, and it seems to me there ought to be strong elements of natalism. And it was the promotion of family formation and assistance to families with children, right, at any income level. That ought to be built in. But then there's the question about keeping people alive so that they can continue to contribute. And the United States, compared to, again, South Korea, not doing a good job. What about your space program? You're a nationalist, right? What about your biomedical research program? How about your high-energy physics, fusion, and thermonuclear energy programs? You don't hear this. They don't have it. As a matter of fact, if we look at Bannon, we will see that he gave a speech here to this group on human dignity in the Vatican. And this is from 2014. And he talks, it's the Dignitas Humanae group in the Vatican. And he's talking a lot about the Judeo-Christian West. He claims to represent the Judeo-Christian West. I'm not sure he does. That he's against atheism, or jihadism. Anyway, here's the point. He says, after the world wars, there was developed an enlightened form of capitalism which led to the increased wealth of the middle class. But then he says, you got to understand me. I'm coming from Goldman Sachs, and that's my background, right? That's the kind of capitalist Bannon says he is. Well, wait a minute. If you really think that there was an enlightened form of capitalism, and there was, it's called the New Deal. It's called a highly regulated, dirigistic, protected American system. And that leads to middle-class wealth. Why don't you get out there and agitate for that rather than this mystical house of cards that we're dealing with? He says he wants the church militant. We're going to have a long and bloody conflict with Islam and the jihadis. Again, I think a lot of this stuff, it leads in exactly the wrong direction, to put it mildly. So anyway, summarizing again, Bannon's 3 points. Sovereignty, meaning national security based on breaking up the existing combinations, right? Strong alliances are going to simply be junked, is the way I read this. Economic nationalism, which is trade, tariffs, immigration, things like this. And again, he doesn't seem to understand that all those other countries have demographic crises. In other words, they all have too few people. The U.S. is the only exception. Again, Russia, Europe, Japan, China, all suffering from too few people. So if you believe that, then you don't want to go down the route that Bannon takes. And then deconstructing the administrative state. Now, as soon as he says deconstructing, I have to start laughing. Once you say deconstructing, right, he's not saying smash the state, although I guess that's the idea, right? That's a little bit more of an anarchoid vocabulary. But deconstructing, how elegant. He wants to deconstruct the administrative state. Well, this is the French philosopher Derrida, Jacques Derrida, who is a watchword for obfuscation, for endless hair-splitting and prose. I can't go through a summary of Derrida. Somewhere there's a speech I gave on this about 20 years ago. But we can quote Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault, F-O-U-C-A-U-L-T, right, the late Derrida, too. Michel Foucault wrote that Derrida is the kind of philosopher that gives BS a bad name. Derrida was ruining the market even for Foucault's own constructions, because they were all getting deconstructed. So deconstructing the administrative state, I don't see that. And I see elements of coercion are creeping into the so-called administrative state. It's getting worse, not better. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's the 24th of February here in the afternoon. So we want to just give you a little flavor of Bannon's address to the Human Dignity gathering in Rome. And one quote that in particular stands out. And he says, Vladimir Putin, when you really look at some of the underpinnings of some of his beliefs today, a lot of those come from what I call Eurasianism. He's got an advisor who harkens back to Julius Evola, or Julius Evola, right? Evola. Orange Julius. Julius Evola. And other writers, he says, Bannon says, of the early 20th century who are really the supporters of what's called the traditionalist movement, which really eventually metastasized into Italian fascism. A lot of people that are traditionalists are attracted to that. One of the reasons is that they believe Putin is at least standing up for traditional institutions, and he's trying to do it in a form of nationalism. And many people in certain countries want to see the sovereignty of their country. They want to see nationalism for their country. They don't believe in the Pan-American Union, and they don't believe in the centralized government of the United States. Hey, what's centralized government? This is a federal system. Anyway, you get the idea. Now, I would just like to focus for a minute on this Julius Evola. I've been aware of Julius Evola for about 40 years, and I heard about him in Rome. So if we want to just give a quick thumbnail, the guy's actual name is Giulio Cesare Andrea Evola. Giulio Cesare. Julius Caesar. Born 1898. So he has been described at different times as really one of the most, well, he's described as anti-egalitarian, anti-liberal, liberal meaning liberalism, parliaments, majority votes, rule of law, things like this. Anti-egalitarian, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, anti-popular. In other words, he's an absolute elitist. He's anything but a man of the people. So here we have the populists telling us how great Julius Evola is. Evola at one point said, essentially his line was, "Don't call me a fascist. I'm a super fascist," said Julius Amendola. Mussolini was one of his admirers. He was a friend and admirer of Heinrich Himmler and the SS of Germany. His main intellectual influences are clearly Friedrich Nietzsche, and this is one of the main common denominators of these people, the negative ones. The negative ones tend to go back to Nietzsche, but also Max Stirner, meaning one of the theoreticians of the most exasperated, the most extreme individualism that one can imagine. In other words, somebody who's way beyond Ayn Rand, right? Somebody who's just off the charts when it comes to predatory individualism. The name of his main book is The Unique. That means you're the unique. The unique person and his property, property. So Julius Evola, stock in trade, esoterics, right? Magic, mysticism, myth, paganism. He's hermetic in the sense that, this is a tradition of mumbo jumbo, right? Going way back. He's interested in the Holy Grail. In terms of Julius Evola as a political thinker, we can look at this as the so-called conservative revolution. And this is something you begin to get in the 1920s, right? Amid the endless pessimism of the post-World War I situation in Europe, right? This was one of the horrible times. It was papered over by, roaring 20s Weimar cabaret, but terrible, terrible time. So the conservative revolution, I think the word is actually invented by Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who was one of the writers for, plays, Richard Strauss librettos and things like this. There's another guy called Armin Mohler, Mohler, I think. Conservative revolution, or Carl Schmitt. And I think on our program, we've talked over the years about Carl Schmitt, right? The guy who gave the legal advice to the National Socialists, right? To the Nazi Party, defended their coup d'etat in Prussia in 1932, and then defended the Night of the Long Knives when the plebeian element was sacrificed to get the support of the army and the big industrialists. So it's a combination of racism. We got national mysticism. Are we beginning to get national mysticism? I think we may have heard some elements of this. Anti-Semitism, to be sure. Let me also point out, Julius Evola, great friend of Codreanu of Romania, right? The so-called Romanian Iron Guards, right? That was the indigenous fascist movement. Now, here's the thing. You notice that Bannon talks about traditionalism. What tradition is he talking about, right? Traditionalism. Traditionalism in the United States means Benjamin Franklin, Governor Winthrop, Massachusetts Bay, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt. There's a tradition that can hold its own, I would say, out there in the world. But what we're talking about here, right, when Bannon tells the people in the Vatican it's a different that traditionalists appreciate. Let's just get this quote again. The Evola and different writers are supporters of what's called the traditionalist movement, which eventually metastasized into Italian fascism. A lot of people that are traditionalists are attracted to that. What tradition is this? Well, after many decades of considering this problem, I can tell you that the tradition they're talking about it's a tradition in a reactionary European sense. In other words, it's sort of the Ancien Régime. In other words, it's the rejection of the French Revolution to a significant degree. What it says is that hierarchy is of great value and that there should be an aristocracy. And it starts from there and then has a few other points. We'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So just a few more notes on Julius Evola, Giulio Cesare Amendola, friend of Heinrich Himmler. And they can see all this stuff on Wikipedia. The article is actually quite decent, right? The father of the traditionalists. But the traditionalists mean people who are class conscious, but not the way we say. They're class conscious in the sense that they want to preserve class discrimination, right? They don't want the career open to talents. They don't want egalitarianism in any form. They say all people are not created equal, say these traditionalists, right? So they want hierarchy. So how do you mix that with this cultural populism? Well, of course, the cultural populism is a wonderful cover for this kind of stuff. Julius Evola once had a magazine called Blood and Spirit. In Germany, it would have been Blood and Soil. So he had to make some concessions to the Italian operation. What else can we say about him? Of course, the United States is completely to be rejected, right? The United States is a mongrel nation, according to Julius Evola, racially decadent. Here, Evola's 1945 essay on American civilization saw America as the final stage of European decline into the interior formlessness of vacuous individualism, conformity, and vulgarity under the universal aegis of money-making. Its mechanistic and rational philosophy of progress combined with a mundane horizon of prosperity to transform the world into an enormous suburban shopping mall. Well, that's not ideal, but it's better than, some kind of killing field in some needless war. Only by opposing the current westernization, Americanization of the world, could Europe challenge both superpowers for global hegemony, writes Julius Evola, right? And he's considered, he's the ideologue of Ordine Nuovo. Ordine Nuovo was, so-called black bombers, right? The bombardieri neri of the 1970s, according to some accounts. So, what else concerning women? Oh my God, this is going to be rough. He is a leading misogynist, and one of his famous essays, 1925, La donna come cosa, woman as a thing. He likes Joseph de Maistre on women, their inferiority. He's essentially against it. The ages of civilization were gendered, writes Evola. The noble stages were masculine. And then, you have, when things are going well, it's hierarchical, heroic, warlike, decisive, and classical. But then the degenerate phases are all feminine, right? Promiscuity, communism, natural rights, and equality. So you get the idea. He's a misogynist, and you can see where the roots of this stuff come from, right? We know that misogynism is a hallmark of fascism, right? Read various books about this. Now, at the end of World War II, when Mussolini was imprisoned on this mountain in southern Italy, Gran Sasso, and Otto Skorzeny and the SS came to free him and took him back, and then they set him up in Milan with the Italian Social Republic. Evola was part of this, right? He was an integral part of it. So I'm afraid any kind of tradition of thought in this case is going to be very bad news, and certainly ought to have no place in American life, right? We don't have this stuff. There's a foreign body. He's also very interesting. He writes to Giovanni Gentile. Giovanni Gentile was the leading philosopher of Italian fascism, the official one. Senator, 4 letters from Evola to Gentile. Letters to Carl Schmitt, 7 letters. These are recent discoveries. Gottfried Benn, another one of these conservative revolution guys. But then also Tristan Tzara, one of the founders of Dadaism, right? The cultural, anti-cultural movement. Anyway, you see all this stuff, right? So we can say, I think the census that we have is that when it comes to the ideology coming out of this situation, we have militarism. We have a fascination with military history, as we reported some weeks ago. And then we have the Howe and Strauss generational theory, okay? The fourth turning, that the seculum is ending, right? In other words, we had one cataclysmic crisis in the late 30s and the early 40s. 80 to 90 years have now gone by. We're due for another cataclysmic crisis. And again, I would say that could be, but it's time to prevent it, right? Why don't we preempt it? But here's the interesting thing is, where does that stuff come from, right? Is there a Wall Street influence there? Because with Bannon, the guy is from Goldman Sachs, along with 6 others, right? We'll try to go through the list. We did that during the week. Strauss and Howe. This guy Howe, when Howe started his career, the first book he wrote was called On Borrowed Time, and his co-author was Peter Peterson. Peter Peterson had been the head of Lehman Brothers, right, the one that triggered the big crash of 2008. Peter Peterson had been the head of Lehman Brothers from 1973 until 1984, 11 years. And it was Lehman Brothers, and then it became Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb. And he was connected to the Rockefeller interests as part of this time, right? Peter Peterson, Nixon appointee, chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. Come on, guys. All you libertarians out there, you're supposed to know this stuff. When you say CFR, the red flags are supposed to go up. Well, instead, Strauss and Howe, in particular Howe, were these pro-austerity people. In other words, Howe actually worked for the Concord Coalition with Senator Rudman, but above all, this guy Peter Peterson. When you look at this stuff about the generations, you'll always see that they say the job of the baby boomers is to give up their Social Security and their Medicare for the sake of future generations. And it's always in there, right? It's like Peter Peterson, told them, put that in there every time, right? We want to see that. We want to see that in there. So, in other words, we have Wall Street influences that are coming in from all corners. Now, this is not an isolated phenomenon. Let me just remind you, in terms of Goldman Sachs, we have Steve Mnuchin now at the Treasury. We have Jim Donovan, who is likely to become the number 2 at Treasury, quoting Washington Post from Thursday. We have Jay Clayton, Goldman Sachs, nominated to head the Securities and Exchange Commission. Bannon is a Goldman Sachs alumnus. Dina Powell, White House economic strategist, Goldman. Gary Cohn, former recent head of president of Goldman Sachs, now heads the National Economic Council. Wilbur Ross headed it's not Goldman anymore, but a private equity firm. And David Malpass, chief economist of Bear Stearns. And that's who's going to do the financial reform. So, militarism and the fourth turning, and then the strange reference to Julius Evola, which attracted the attention of the New York Times with a complete article. So that seems to be the way the wind is blowing right now. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Okay, welcome back to World Crisis Radio, and our time has fled so fast. It's now the 8th segment, so we're going to wrap up our program here on the 24th of February. Remember, AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. But now, in terms of the worldwide movement, okay, because some people try to portray this ideology as being a worldwide movement, and I say not doing too well. Let's go, start with Netherlands, right? The Netherlands, right? The Dutch. They're going to have an election fairly soon, and we have this guy Geert Wilders, who was ahead. They were going to win. The Wilders party was going to win. But then he began talking about Moroccan scum, and I'm quoting him. I'm sorry to have to say it, but that's his view, right? So Moroccan scum, says Wilders, and the result of that is in the last 10 days or so, the Wilders party has lost 3 seats in the projections. So he goes from probable majority or shoe-in, almost guaranteed majority, to probable second-place status. That's that's important. In Germany, the Big Apple, the Social Democrats under Martin Schulz, Eurocrat, okay, Eurocrat, but a moderate, and he's interested in diminishing economic inequality. The Social Democrats have gone up 4 percentage points. They're now at 32%. The CDU-CSU, Christian Democrats nationwide and in Bavaria, are down 3%, and they are at 31%. This is the first time in many, many moons that the Social Democrats have pulled ahead of the CDU-CSU, okay? And it's done on the basis of skepticism about the American administration, to put it mildly, and then the attempt to diminish economic inequality, which is something you don't hear about from this White House. Now, this is done by the first program of German TV, right? ARD, first program. We are then told that in third place only come the alternatives for Germany, right? Alternative für Deutschland. This is the Frauke Petry party. She's not very charismatic. They get 11%, and I think they're going nowhere. They're stagnating, and they thought they had a chance to get the entire thing. Green Party, 8%. Left-wing party, Die Linke, 7%. Free Democrats, Die Liberalen, the liberals, 6%. And we always remember Loriot and his treatment of this is a German comedian, the FDP. So this is Weimarization for sure. In other words, the Social Democrats and the CDU, CSU are fighting it out at 32 to 31. But then you've got the alternatives for Germany, the Greens, the left, and the liberals. So you've got 6 parties where you used to have 2 or 3 or really 2. So not so good. But anyway, the main thing is that the Anti-Immigrant Party is going essentially nowhere, and the centrist, right, the Mitte, is what is getting more attention. Okay, in Rome today, the mayor of Rome, who comes from the Beppe Grillo 5-star party, this is Raggi, Mayor Raggi, R-A-G-G-I, has been hospitalized today. She had to be taken to the hospital a couple of hours ago, and this is Friday, the 24th of February, because she was facing a very tense meeting about whether the city government of Rome was going to build a new soccer stadium for the Roma soccer team instead of the existing Olympic stadium, right, left over from the 1930s, I guess, 1936 Olympics or 1940 Olympics that never were. She was taken to the hospital. She was just not feeling well. So we're told that her administration, as we talked about it here, has been a catastrophe of corruption and arrests, and she's under investigation for abuse of her office, right? Influence peddling, cronyism, stuff like this. Here's another good piece of news. Stoke-on-Trent. This is supposedly the Brexit capital of Great Britain. I think the Brexit won with 69% in those heady days of last June when the world seemed to have gone mad, and maybe did go mad. The Brexit, well, the capital of Brexit has now rejected the UK Independence Party. And not just anybody, but they rejected a guy called Paul Nuttall, 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 I don't know. Paul Nuttall was defeated by the Labour Party candidate, Gareth Snell, 7,800 votes to 5,200 votes in a by-election. Right? This is not the whole big election, but it just means this seat had become vacant. So this is considered to be a signal defeat for the UKIP, UK Independence Party, the pro-Brexit party. This guy, Nigel Farage, is now he's living a nomadic existence, different places, right? He shows up. But we'll see about him. But at the moment, doesn't look so good. Marine Le Pen, the anti-immigrant candidate to become president of France, she is accused of having 2 people, one of them her bodyguard and the other one an aide, that were kept. She had them on the payroll in Brussels working for the European Union because she's a Euro deputy. She's a member of the European Parliament. But these 2 people were, one of them has been indicted, I think. I think it's the bodyguard who was indicted. But the idea was that the accusation is that they were working in France for her on this presidential campaign and were not doing things connected to the European union. So Marine Le Pen says that she will not answer. She's not going to talk to the police. They say, can we question you? Can we interview you? No, because I am a member of parliament. She's claiming parliamentary immunity, but it also looks like this idea that somehow some people are more equal than others, or some people are above the law. This ethos may be playing a role. All right. Now, the last thing, which we don't really have time to do justice to, is the existence of a kind of parallel. We mentioned this once before. We mentioned this in the context of a New York Times article by David Sanger. There is now a new organism inside the White House, and it's called the Special Initiatives Group. And what the Special Initiatives Group is, it's a parallel National Security Council under the domination of Bannon, of his associate Gorka, and others. Okay? So Bannon and Gorka are in there, and Flynn was there for a while until he was ushered out. It is the Special Initiatives Group. There's a very interesting article in the Daily Beast by Kimberly Dozier, who is a veteran correspondent. And the argument for this is it doesn't make policy, but it informs policy. And those who are familiar with the workings of a White House simply point out that this is nothing but